1915, Kentucky. The forbidden history of the Wren family who heard voices in the walls of their own home begins in the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains cradle secrets as old as the hills themselves. In these isolated valleys, cut off from the changing world beyond, certain families live by their own rules, guided by necessity and ignorance rather than societal norms. The Wren family homestead stood 3 miles from the nearest dirt road, accessible only by a winding path that disappeared into dense woodland. The 2-story wooden house, built by Elijah Wren's grandfather in 1843, seemed to grow from the hillside itself, weathered gray boards blending with the surrounding rock and timber. By 1915, the house had begun to sink into itself, the foundation settling unevenly into the mountain soil. Elijah Wren, at 57, was the patriarch of a household that rarely ventured beyond their 80-acre property. His deeply lined face told the story of generations who had worked the same unforgiving land. His pale blue eyes, a distinctive trait shared by all Wrens, set deep in a face weathered by sun and hardship. His wife Martha, also his first cousin, had given him 8 children over 20 years, though only 5 survived to adulthood. The Wren children displayed the unmistakable marks of their lineage: unusually close-set eyes of that same pale blue, prominent brow ridges, and receding chins that seemed to fade into their necks. The oldest son, Thomas, at 32, had married his aunt's daughter from the neighboring valley, herself a distant Wren. Their 3 children already showed signs of the difficulties that plagued the family: delayed speech, unsteady gait, and facial asymmetry that grew more pronounced with each generation. Local physician Dr. James Harlow first documented the Wren family case after being called to the property in April 1915 when Martha fell ill with pneumonia. What he discovered in that remote homestead would haunt his medical journals for years to come. The Wren household exists in a state of isolation that exceeds mere geographic seclusion, Dr. Harlow wrote in his private notes, recently discovered in a county archive. It represents a closed human ecosystem that has turned inward upon itself for too many generations, producing physical and mental peculiarities that I have not encountered elsewhere in my 20 years of rural practice. The most disturbing aspect of the Wren family saga was not their physical appearance, but what the locals called the Wren affliction, a tendency to hear voices emanating from inside the walls of their home. These auditory hallucinations typically began in adolescence, growing more pronounced with age. By 1915, all adult Wrens reported hearing these voices, which they attributed not to mental illness, but to the spirits of ancestors trapped within the house's structure. "The voices began when I was 13, Thomas Wren told Dr. Harlow during his mother's treatment. "At first, just whispers at night, like someone talking through a thick blanket. By the time I was 20, they was clear as day, calling my name, telling me things only a Wren should know." What Thomas didn't reveal to the doctor was the nature of those whispered commands, instructions that reinforced the family's isolation and their practice of keeping bloodlines pure through marriage between close relatives. For generations, Wren had married Wren, creating a genetic bottleneck that manifested in increasingly severe physical and cognitive impairments. The county records from 1890 to 1915 show at least 7 marriages between Wren cousins, 2 between uncle and niece, and 1 between half-siblings who shared the same father. Each union produced children who carried a heavier genetic burden than the generation before, their facial features growing more distinctive, their health problems more severe. Martha Wren recovered from her pneumonia, but Dr. Harlow's concerns about the family's living conditions prompted him to alert county authorities. When the sheriff and a social worker attempted to visit the property in May 1915, they were met with shotguns and threats. The Wrens, guided by their ancestral voices, had withdrawn further into their isolated world. The voices in the walls, Dr. Harlow later theorized, were likely symptoms of an inherited neurological disorder, exacerbated by malnutrition and isolation. Modern genetic science would later identify such hallucinations as potential symptoms of certain recessive genetic conditions that become exponentially more common in consanguineous families. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to continue receiving these shocking, true historical accounts that mainstream history has tried to erase. These forgotten stories reveal the dark truth of America's past that powerful institutions don't want you to know. As summer approached in 1915, rumors about the Wren family spread through the surrounding communities. At the general store in nearby Pikeville, locals exchanged whispered accounts of strange sights and sounds from the Wren property. Hunters claimed to have glimpsed pale figures moving between the trees at dusk, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Others reported hearing eerie, high-pitched wailing carrying across the valley on still nights. Sarah Cooper, a midwife who had assisted with births in the area for over 30 years, had been called to the Wren home twice. Her accounts, recorded in a series of letters to her sister in Louisville, provide rare glimpses into the family's private life. "I have brought children into this world under all manner of circumstances," she wrote in 1913, "but never have I witnessed anything like what occurs in that house." The newest Wren child came into this world already marked by the family's affliction. The facial structure so distinctive that one cannot mistake it for anything other than the result of too many generations turning inward. More troubling still is how they gather around the birthing bed, whispering of voices only they can hear, as though receiving instructions from unseen presences. The Wren family's genetic isolation had created a cascade of health issues that worsened with each generation. The youngest children suffered from congenital heart defects, weakened immune systems, and developmental delays. Most disturbing were the neurological symptoms, the auditory hallucinations that all family members eventually developed, typically beginning in adolescence. Elijah's youngest daughter, Mary, age 16 in 1915, exhibited the most severe manifestation of the Wren affliction. She claimed the voices in the walls spoke constantly, guiding her every action. Mary's journals, discovered decades later during the demolition of the house, reveal the progression of her condition. "The voices grow stronger with each passing day," she wrote in spidery, uneven handwriting. "They tell me secrets about our family, about our special blood that must be kept pure. They show me visions of what happens when Wren blood mixes with outsiders, children born wrong, family lines withering away. Mother says I hear them clearest because I am most pure of all the Wrens living." Mary's purity referred to her parentage. She was the product of a union between Elijah and his half-sister Rebecca, a relationship kept hidden even from other family members. This exceptionally close consanguinity had produced in Mary both the most severe physical manifestations of inbreeding and the most profound neurological symptoms. County schoolteacher Elizabeth Thornton encountered Mary Wren just once when attempting to conduct a census of school-aged children in the area. Her account, preserved in county education records, describes a girl with features so malformed as to inspire immediate pity, speaking in a manner suggesting she conversed with others not present in the room, her attention constantly diverted by sounds only she could hear. The isolation of the Wren family was not merely geographic, but increasingly psychological. As their genetic inheritance grew more problematic, they withdrew further from a society that viewed them with fear and disgust. This withdrawal was encouraged by the voices that guided them, hallucinations that reinforced their separation from the outside world. Dr. Harlow's continued attempts to provide medical assistance to the family met with increasing resistance. "It appears that their condition creates a self-reinforcing cycle," he wrote in his medical journal in June 1915. "The more pronounced their afflictions become, the more they rely on each other exclusively, interpreting their symptoms not as evidence of their precarious genetic heritage, but as a special gift that sets them apart from others." The middle-aged Wrens displayed a range of health problems by 1915. Thomas suffered from unexplained seizures that had begun in his 20s. His wife Jane, herself a Wren cousin, had given birth to 5 children, only 2 of whom survived infancy. Both survivors showed signs of the progressive neurological decline that characterized the family. Elijah's brother Isaiah, who lived in a smaller cabin on the property, had developed early-onset dementia by age 49. His cognitive decline accelerated the family's isolation, as he had previously been their primary contact with the outside world, occasionally traveling to town for supplies. "Isaiah Wren appeared at my store yesterday," wrote general store owner George Miller in a letter to his brother. "The change in him since his last visit 6 months ago was shocking. He stood staring at items on shelves as though they were foreign objects, mumbling about voices in the walls telling him which provisions to purchase. When I attempted to assist him, he grew agitated, insisting that only a Wren could understand Wren business. He left with only half the goods he typically purchases, and I fear for how the family will manage through winter. By late summer 1915, the Wren family had become a subject of morbid fascination throughout the county. Local churches organized prayer groups dedicated to the Mountain family afflicted by demons. More pragmatic community members discussed alerting state authorities, concerned about the children's welfare. What none of them understood was that the Wren family's condition represented the culmination of nearly a century of genetic isolation, a living demonstration of what happens when human beings become too genetically similar through repeated consanguineous marriages. The voices in the walls were both symptom and cause of their continued isolation, a self-perpetuating cycle that would soon reach its breaking point. The autumn of 1915 brought an unexpected visitor to the Wren property. Henry Collins, a field researcher for the newly established Eugenics Record Office based in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, had heard rumors of the isolated family while collecting data on defective bloodlines in Appalachia. Collins arrived in Kentucky with scientific curiosity that quickly transformed into horrified fascination. Collins's field notes, preserved in university archives, provide the most detailed external account of the Wren family ecosystem. The Wren case represents perhaps the most striking example of consanguinity effects I have documented, he wrote. The family exhibits a constellation of physical and neurological symptoms that appear to intensify with each generation, creating what can only be described as a new and deteriorating human subspecies. The scientific language of Collins's era fails to disguise the tragedy unfolding within the Wren household. His clinical descriptions document children with stunted growth, asymmetrical facial features, and cognitive abilities that plateaued early in development. Most adults displayed tremors in their extremities by their 30s, with full neurological deterioration typically occurring by 50. Collins was particularly interested in the auditory hallucinations experienced by family members, the voices in the walls that had become central to Wren family culture. With permission from Elijah, who viewed Collins as a potentially sympathetic outsider, the researcher conducted basic psychological assessments of several family members. The hallucinations follow a consistent pattern, Collins noted. They begin in adolescence, coinciding with physical maturation, and initially manifest as indistinct whispers heard primarily at night. As the individual ages, these hallucinations become more frequent and distinct, eventually developing into clear voices attributed to deceased family members. Most striking is the shared nature of these delusions. Family members independently report hearing the same messages and instructions, suggesting a culturally transmitted phenomenon built upon a foundation of inherited neurological dysfunction. What Collins witnessed during his 2-week stay at the Wren property went beyond scientific observation. He documented daily life in a household governed by hallucinations, where decisions about farming, child-rearing, and marriage were influenced by voices no outsider could hear. Mary Wren, now 16, had become the primary interpreter of the voices, her severe neurological symptoms having convinced the family that she possessed the strongest connection to their ancestors. Collins observed family members approaching Mary throughout the day, asking her to listen to the walls for guidance on matters ranging from when to harvest crops to which cousins should marry. The girl sits with her ear pressed to the wooden boards for minutes at a time, Collins wrote, then delivers pronouncements in a monotone voice entirely unlike her normal speaking pattern. The family receives these messages with unquestioning acceptance, even when they contradict practical considerations or basic self-interest. Collins documented a particularly disturbing scene when a distant Wren cousin arrived from a neighboring county, hoping to arrange a marriage between his son and one of Elijah's granddaughters. After initial discussions, Mary was consulted, pressing her ear to various sections of wall before announcing that the match was unsuitable because the cousin's bloodline had been tainted 2 generations back by marriage to an outsider. Despite the obvious advantages of introducing even slightly more distant genetic material into their pool, Collins noted, the family rejected the match based entirely on the hallucinated instructions received through the wall. Their isolation is thus perpetuated not merely by geography, but by the very neurological symptoms caused by their inbreeding. The Wren family's daily functioning had deteriorated significantly by 1915. Simple tasks took extraordinary effort, with family members often stopping mid-activity to listen to the walls. Meals were prepared according to specific instructions received through these hallucinations, with certain foods forbidden because the voices disapprove. Fields lay partially tended, livestock neglected. If you're feeling the chills down your spine right now about this real American family's dark secret, type, "I can hear them too," in the comments below. Let us know you're part of this community that dares to explore the hidden histories others are too afraid to acknowledge. Collins's most alarming observations concerned the youngest generation of Wrens. Children as young as 4 reported hearing whispers in the walls, suggesting that the hallucinatory experiences were being implanted through suggestion long before any neurological symptoms would naturally appear. The children were taught from infancy that their family was special, their blood pure in ways outsiders could never understand. The environment within the Wren household represents a closed system of reinforced delusion, Collins wrote. Children exhibiting physical symptoms of their genetic inheritance are told these features mark them as true Wrens. Their eventual hallucinations are anticipated and celebrated as signs they have been accepted by their ancestors. What medical science would identify as the tragic consequences of consanguinity, the Wren family has incorporated into their identity as markers of distinction. By the time Collins departed in October 1915, he had documented 27 living Wren family members across 4 generations, all displaying varying degrees of the physical and neurological symptoms associated with their genetic isolation. His recommendation to state authorities was unequivocal. Intervention was necessary, particularly to remove the youngest children before they became fully indoctrinated into the family's delusional system. Winter descended early on the Kentucky mountains in 1915, bringing with it a bitter cold that seemed to penetrate the very walls of the Wren house. As temperatures dropped, the family withdrew further into their increasingly dysfunctional world, the voices in the walls growing more insistent as their isolation deepened. County records indicate that Henry Collins's report to Kentucky authorities resulted in a planned intervention scheduled for December 1915. A team consisting of the county sheriff, a state social worker, and Dr. Harlow prepared to visit the property with papers authorizing the removal of minor children for medical evaluation. What they could not have anticipated was how the voices in the walls would respond to this threat. "The ancestors know they're coming to take the children," Mary Wren reportedly announced 3 days before the scheduled intervention. "They say we must protect the bloodline at all costs. We must move deeper into the mountain, away from those who would destroy our family." Elijah, whose health had deteriorated significantly through the autumn, initially resisted this directive. At 57, with advancing symptoms of the family's neurological condition, he questioned whether the family could survive a winter move to their hunting cabin 2 miles deeper into the wilderness. But as always, the voices prevailed. On the morning of December 12, 1915, when authorities arrived at the Wren homestead, they found the house abandoned, still containing most of the family's possessions. A hasty departure was evident. Food remained on the table, clothing hung from pegs on the walls, and the family Bible lay open on a wooden stand. Only the family themselves had vanished, taking minimal supplies and disappearing into the vast forested wilderness that extended for miles beyond their property. The county mounted a search effort that lasted 3 days before being abandoned due to heavy snowfall and treacherous conditions. Sheriff's reports indicate that tracks were followed for approximately 1 mile before being lost in rocky terrain. Local hunters familiar with the area suggested the family might have headed toward an old trapping cabin known to exist somewhere on the mountain's northern face, but none were willing to guide authorities to it during winter conditions. What happened to the Wren family during that brutal winter remains partially documented through a remarkable source, a journal kept by Thomas Wren, discovered in the spring of 1916 near the remains of a makeshift camp. The journal, now preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives, provides a harrowing account of the family's final months. "The voices grow stronger away from the house," Thomas wrote in shaky handwriting dated December 18th. "Mother says it's because we're closer to the old burial ground where the first Wrens were laid to rest. Mary spends hours with her ear to the trees now, saying the ancestors speak through the wood no matter where we go." The journal describes increasing hardship as supplies dwindled. The hunting cabin they sought proved too small for the entire family. forcing them to construct inadequate lean-tos nearby. Children fell ill with respiratory infections that quickly worsened in the harsh conditions. "3 of the little ones can't stop coughing," Thomas wrote on January 2, 1916. Isaiah says the voices tell him their suffering is necessary, that the weak blood must be purged for the family to grow stronger. I find myself wondering for the first time if the voices might be wrong. This questioning of the hallucinations that had guided family decisions for generations marked a significant break in the Wren family's closed belief system. As conditions worsened, Thomas's entries show increasing doubt about the wisdom of following these auditory commands. "Father passed yesterday," reads an entry from January 15th. His last words were that he could finally see the faces belonging to the voices, and they were not our ancestors at all, but something else wearing our family's faces. Mary says he spoke blasphemy, that the true voices have abandoned him for his lack of faith. I find myself listening to the walls less and less. By February, Thomas's journal documents the deaths of 9 family members, including 4 children. The survivors had split into 2 factions, those still faithfully following Mary's interpretations of the voices, and a smaller group led by Thomas who proposed returning to the original homestead and seeking medical help. "The divide grows deeper," he wrote on February 8th. "Mary's group believes suffering will purify our bloodline. They speak of sacrifices that must be made, of removing the tainted blood from our family tree. Last night I heard them discussing which of the remaining children are true Wrens and which show signs of weakened blood. I fear what they intend." The final journal entry, dated February 12, 1916, reads simply, "They've taken the children deeper into the woods. Said the ancestors demand a return to the old ways. I'm going after them at first light. If anyone finds this, know that the voices in our walls were never our salvation, but our destruction." When spring thaws finally allowed for a comprehensive search of the area in April 1916, authorities discovered the remains of numerous Wren family members scattered across several sites on the northern face of the mountain. Evidence suggested that exposure and illness had claimed most lives, though certain arrangements of the bodies troubled investigators. Dr. Harlow, who participated in the recovery effort, noted in his official report, "The positioning of the deceased suggests ritual significance rather than natural death postures. Several of the children were found in a circular arrangement around what appears to have been a small fire pit, their hands bound with strips of cloth." I hesitate to speculate on what occurred in the final days of the Wren family, but evidence suggests something beyond mere tragic exposure to the elements. Of the 27 Wrens documented by Henry Collins in October 1915, only 3 survived the winter: Thomas, his wife Jane, and their oldest son Edward, age 12. They were discovered by a hunting party in early March, having made their way to a logging camp on the far side of the mountain. The 3 surviving Wrens, Thomas, Jane, and young Edward, were transported to the county hospital, suffering from malnutrition, frostbite, and severe psychological trauma. Their physical recovery would prove faster than their psychological healing, as they struggled to adjust to a world without the voices that had guided their family for generations. Court records from April 1916 document a custody hearing for Edward Wren, where authorities debated whether Thomas and Jane were fit parents given the family's history. Dr. Harlow testified about the neurological condition that had plagued the Wren family, describing it as a hereditary affliction exacerbated by continuous intermarriage within an extremely limited genetic pool. The auditory hallucinations experienced by the Wrens represent a genetically transmitted neurological disorder, Dr. Harlow stated in his testimony. When combined with cultural isolation and reinforcement of these hallucinations as meaningful communication, the result was a closed system of delusion that ultimately led to tragedy. Thomas Wren's own testimony provides the most comprehensive first-hand account of life within the family. Speaking haltingly, often pausing as though listening for voices that no longer came, he described generations of Wrens who had married close relatives because the walls told us our blood must remain pure. "I believe the voices were our ancestors guiding us," Thomas testified. "Now I understand they were symptoms of our decline. Each generation heard them more clearly because each generation carried a heavier burden of our family's mistakes." The court ultimately granted custody of Edward to a maternal aunt who had married outside the Wren family and lived in Louisville. Thomas and Jane were permitted supervised visitation, contingent on their continued medical treatment and counseling. Henry Collins, the eugenics researcher whose documentation had triggered the intervention attempt, published a paper on the Wren case in a scientific journal in late 1916. His clinical language failed to capture the human tragedy, describing the family as a naturally occurring experiment in human degeneration through sustained consanguinity. Modern genetic analysis would later identify the likely condition affecting the Wren family as an autosomal recessive disorder that, when expressed, caused progressive neurological deterioration, including auditory hallucinations. In families with normal genetic diversity, such recessive conditions rarely manifest. In the Wren family's closed genetic system, where cousins married cousins for generations, the likelihood of inheriting two copies of the defective gene increased exponentially with each consanguineous union. The voices in the walls that guided the Wren family to their destruction were, in reality, symptoms of their genetic collapse, the result of a century of inbreeding that had concentrated deleterious genes until they could no longer be escaped. The original Wren homestead remained abandoned for decades, gaining a reputation among locals as a haunted place where voices could still be heard whispering from the walls on quiet nights. In 1952, the structure was finally demolished during expansion of a local mining operation. Workers reported uneasiness throughout the demolition, with several claiming to hear whispers from the wood as they tore down the walls. Thomas Wren lived until 1943, spending his final years in a state hospital where he received treatment for the progressive neurological condition that had afflicted his family for generations. Jane died earlier in 1928, having never fully adjusted to life away from the isolated mountain community where she had spent her first 40 years. Edward Wren, raised by his aunt in Louisville, broke the cycle that had trapped his family for generations. He married a woman with no relation to the Wren family, attended college on the GI Bill after serving in World War II, and became a high school biology teacher. He had 3 children, none of whom exhibited any symptoms of the condition that had devastated his family. In a remarkable epilogue to the Wren family tragedy, Edward returned to the site of the former homestead in 1965, bringing with him a geneticist interested in documenting the case. Together, they located the remote area where many of his relatives had perished during that terrible winter of 1915-1916. "My father always said that in the end, he stopped hearing the voices," Edward told the geneticist. "He said the silence was initially terrifying, then liberating. The walls had whispered to the Wrens for generations, telling us to turn inward, to trust only our own blood. It nearly destroyed us all." The geneticist's paper, published in 1967, used the Wren case to illustrate the dangers of genetic isolation and consanguinity. Modern genetic counseling practices were partly shaped by lessons learned from cases like the Wrens, where closed genetic systems created cascading health problems across generations. The voices in the walls of the Wren house, those auditory hallucinations that guided the family toward their ultimate destruction, serve as a powerful metaphor for the dangers of isolation, both genetic and social. Cut off from the broader human community, turning inward generation after generation, the Wren family created their own slow-motion tragedy. Today, the former Wren property lies beneath the waters of a reservoir created in the 1970s. Local legends still speak of strange sounds, sometimes heard by fishermen, whispers that seem to rise from beneath the water on still nights, voices calling for the return of the family that once listened so faithfully to their destructive guidance. The story of the Wren family stands as a stark reminder of human vulnerability, how isolation, ignorance, and the biological consequences of inbreeding can create a perfect storm of tragedy. Their voices may have been silenced, but their story speaks volumes about the fundamental human need for genetic diversity and connection to the broader community. If you've watched all the way to the end of this dark historical investigation, you clearly appreciate these forbidden historical accounts. Leave a comment saying, "I watched it all," so I can get to know you and understand who truly values the hidden stories on this channel. Make sure you're subscribed for more shocking historical revelations. Hit the like button if this story affected you, and share this with anyone brave enough to face the dark truths of our past that mainstream history tries to erase.